The old Ford pickup rumbled down the gravel access road, the familiar smell of lake water and pine filling the cab. It was my favorite part of the morning. For a guy who'd spent 30 years in the belly of a Navy destroyer, surrounded by the constant hum of turbines and the scent of diesel fuel, a quiet marina at dawn was paradise. Especially this one. My marina. The sun was just starting to burn off the morning mist that clung to the water, and out at the end of slip 12, I could just make out her silhouette. The Hannah's Kiss. A 38-foot wooden cruiser my late wife had fallen in love with when we were just kids, staring at magazine pictures we could never afford. I found her rotting in a boatyard 6 years ago, 2 years after Hannah passed. Buying her was an impulse, restoring her became my mission. Every plank I sanded, every coat of varnish I meticulously applied, felt like a conversation I still got to have with her. The boat wasn't just wood and brass, it was a floating memory, the last big project we never got to do together. I pulled into my usual spot behind the bait shop, grabbed my thermos of black coffee, and began the walk down the main dock. The old boards creaked under my boots, a sound as comforting to me as a ticking clock. Everything was just as it should be. The gentle lapping of water against the hulls, the distant cry of a gull, the soft clinking of rigging against aluminum masts. Then I saw it. A flash of angry, laminated red tacked right onto the piling next to my slip. It was one of those plastic violation tags, the kind designed to survive a hurricane, an ugly intrusion on the morning peace. Bold, black letters screamed from behind the plastic, "Final Notice." Beneath that, an official-looking crest for the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association. I pulled the tag off the nail. It felt cheap and arrogant in my hand. A list of violations was checked off in smudged ink: unauthorized vessel, failure to display community permit, delinquent mooring fees. At the bottom, a hastily scrawled note in Sharpie: payment of $1,400 due immediately. Contact the compliance office. I looked up at my boat. She was gleaming. The mahogany deck shone like a polished dining table. The chrome fittings caught the morning light. An unauthorized vessel. She was the prettiest thing on the whole lake. I scanned the shoreline. The Lakeview Estates houses were across the water, a collection of big, beige boxes with perfectly manicured lawns, identical down to the last decorative shrub. They were a mile away as the crow flies. I didn't live there. I never had. My house was 5 miles in the other direction on a few acres of quiet, unincorporated land. This marina wasn't part of their development. It was zoned commercial, had been for 50 years. I owned it. Lock, stock, and dock. This had to be a mistake. Some new, overeager board member must have gotten a map upside down. I chuckled to myself, crumpled the tag in my fist, and tossed it into the trash can on my way back to the truck. A mistake. Nothing more. Back at home, I decided to make the call anyway, just to clear it up. Get some poor soul on the phone, explain they had the wrong property, and that would be the end of it. I found the number on their website and dialed. After a dozen rings and a series of automated menus that made me feel like I was trying to launch a missile, a sharp, clipped voice answered, "Lakeview Compliance, Miriam speaking." I calmly explained the situation, my name, the location of the marina, the fact that it was private commercial property, not part of their HOA. Miriam let out a long, tired sigh. It was the kind of sound someone makes when they're about to explain something painfully obvious to a child. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, fake patience, "our extended community covenants cover all properties with lakefront access to ensure a consistent and high-value aesthetic for our residents. Your vessel is in violation." I almost laughed. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your covenants don't extend to my deed. I own this land. You have no jurisdiction here." There was a sound of shuffling papers, a deliberate, theatrical rustling meant to intimidate. "Mr. Hanley, we have notified you multiple times about this delinquency. Our records show 3 prior warnings were mailed to the address on file for that slip. That got my attention. I checked my post office box twice a week. Nothing. I've received nothing from you, I said, my voice a little firmer now. There must be an error in your records. You must be sending them to the wrong address. She ignored me completely. Furthermore, she continued, her voice hardening, your boat is an eyesore. It's old, wooden, and doesn't fit the modern character of our community. It's frankly hurting property values. That was it. That was the line. I thought of the thousands of hours I'd spent, the knuckles I'd busted, the love I'd poured into that restoration, all to honor my wife. And this woman, this disembodied voice on the phone, called it an eyesore. I took a slow, deliberate breath. Getting angry wouldn't solve a clerical error. Listen, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. Just send me a copy of the document that legally subordinates my Marina to your Homeowners Association. If you can provide that, we can talk. If not, I expect you to cease this harassment immediately. She replied with a smug little huff, you'll be hearing from us, Mr. Hanley. And the line went dead. I hung up the phone, more irritated than worried. She was a bully with a clipboard, nothing more. A paperwork tyrant in a beige kingdom. They had no legal leg to stand on, and she knew it. The whole thing was just a ridiculous bureaucratic overreach that would sort itself out once they realized they were barking up the wrong tree. I was wrong. Terribly wrong. For a week, I heard nothing. The silence felt like a victory, a confirmation that Miriam had looked at a county parcel map, felt like a fool, and quietly dropped the whole absurd affair. I went about my business, checked on the boat every morning, and nearly forgot about her and her imaginary extended covenants. Then the mail came. It wasn't a regular envelope waiting in my P.O. box. It was a certified letter, the kind you have to sign for on a little electronic scanner. My heart sank a little as I signed the postman's device. It felt different. Official. Back in my truck, I slit the heavy envelope open with my pocketknife. The same cheap Lakeview Estates crest was at the top of the page. It was an official invoice, a long list of fines itemized with a kind of vicious creativity. There were unapproved color scheme fees, failure to maintain modern appearance penalties, non-conforming vessel charges, and, of course, late fees stacked on top of late fees. At the bottom of the page, in bold, unforgiving print, was the total, $11,200. My blood ran cold, but it was the final sentence that really stopped my breath. It read, failure to remit payment within 72 hours will result in further enforcement action, up to and including removal of the offending property at the owner's expense. They weren't making a mistake. This was a threat. This was a declaration of war. They were coming for my wife's boat. I spent the next 3 days on the phone with a property lawyer. He was a decent guy, a young man named Peterson with a sharp mind who confirmed everything I already knew. The HOA had no claim. Zero. He drafted a blistering cease and desist letter, citing state property laws, county zoning ordinances, and demanding they retract their bogus fine and issue a formal apology. He sent it via a bonded courier who got a signature upon delivery. We gave them 48 hours to respond. We heard nothing. Total, complete silence. My lawyer said that was a good sign. It meant they were cornered, talking to their own attorneys who were likely telling them how badly they had screwed up. They'll go quiet and hope you go away, Jack, he'd advised. Just sit tight. Don't engage them. The ball is in our court. So, I sat tight. For one agonizing week, I forced myself to stay away from the Marina. I worked in my garage, tinkering with an old lawnmower engine, trying to keep my hands and my mind busy. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that $11,000 invoice. I heard Miriam's condescending voice calling my wife's beautiful boat an eyesore. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. The anxiety was eating me alive. I needed to see her. I needed to run my hand along her polished rail and remember why I was fighting this. I turned onto the access road and knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. There was yellow caution tape strung between the trees at the entrance, flapping in the breeze. Up ahead, I saw flashing blue and red lights. 2 police cruisers were parked near the docks, their presence a harsh, jarring intrusion on the morning peace. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I parked the truck and got out, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel. I ducked under the tape and started walking, then walking faster. A young officer saw me approaching and put his hand up. "Sir, this is a restricted area. I'm going to have to ask you to stay back." I didn't stop. "That's my Marina," I said, my voice flat, almost a whisper. I kept my eyes fixed on slip 12, but there was nothing there. Just an empty, gaping space of dark, choppy water. My boat was gone. For a split second, a wild, desperate hope flickered through me. They towed it. They moved it to an impound lot. It was a stupid, expensive hassle, but she was safe. It was just a problem that money could fix. Then I saw the debris. Splintered pieces of mahogany bobbed in the water. A piece of the brass nameplate, the part that read Hannah's K, lay half submerged in the mud near the shore. And on the land, fresh tracks from heavy machinery. Deep, wide gouges torn into the earth. They hadn't towed her. They had destroyed her. My legs felt weak, like they might buckle. I leaned against a piling just to keep from falling. It was like getting a punch to the gut that you never saw coming. Decades of discipline, of keeping my composure in situations on a ship where one mistake could mean life or death, just evaporated. All I felt was a hollow, ringing emptiness. That boat was my therapy. It was my connection to her. They hadn't just demolished a vessel, they had taken a bulldozer to a memory. I saw one of my neighbors, an old fisherman named Dale, standing by his own slip, looking pale. He saw me and walked over, his face grim. "Jack, I'm so sorry," he whispered. "It happened yesterday. They came with an excavator. I got some of it on my phone." He fumbled with his old flip phone and after a few clicks, held it out to me. The video was shaky, filmed from a distance, but it was clear enough. A huge yellow machine with a clawed bucket slamming down again and again on the boat's beautiful wooden hull. The sound of splintering, cracking wood was sickening, a sound I'll never forget. Then a voice from off-camera, sharp and imperious. "Make sure you get all of it. I want it flattened. Just finish the job." The camera wobbled and zoomed in on the person shouting. It was Miriam Slade. She stood there with a clipboard and a smug, satisfied look on her face as she watched them tear my wife's memory to pieces. I handed the phone back to Dale, my hands shaking with a rage so cold and so profound it felt like ice water flooding my veins. I walked over to the senior police officer who was taking notes on a little pad. I explained who I was. I told him this was my private property. I told him they had destroyed my boat, my property, valued at well over $250,000, without a court order, without any legal right whatsoever. He listened, his expression impassive, practiced. "I understand your frustration, sir," he said in that infuriatingly calm tone cops use. "But from what we've been told by the HOA's representative, this was a scheduled removal of abandoned property in violation of community covenants. This appears to be a civil dispute." "A civil dispute?" He said it like they'd trimmed my hedges over the property line. I pointed to the wreckage floating in the water, the splintered mahogany, the glint of broken brass. "Officer, that is grand larceny and felony destruction of private property. I want to press charges." He shook his head slowly, deliberately not looking at the evidence. "You'll need to take that up with your attorneys, sir. We can't make an arrest. There's no crime to report here. They wouldn't file a report. They wouldn't even investigate. They just stood there, guarding the scene of the crime for the criminals who had hired them for a security detail. I called the HOA office, my voice shaking with the effort of keeping it level, demanding to speak to Miriam. The receptionist, in a chirpy, pre-recorded voice, told me the entire board was in a closed-door meeting and could not be disturbed. They were hiding. I got back in my truck and drove home. The grief was still there, a heavy, suffocating weight in my chest, but something else was rising up to meet it. Fury. But it wasn't a hot, blinding fury. It was a calm, methodical, engineer's fury. The kind that builds a plan, checks the schematics, and executes it with precision. They thought this was over. They thought they had won. They'd beaten me with paperwork and a bulldozer because they thought I was just some old man renting a boat slip. They thought I would file a lawsuit that would take years and drain my savings. They were about to learn just how catastrophically wrong they were. Back at my house, I walked to the den and knelt in front of the old fireproof box tucked away in the back of the closet. I spun the combination lock and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, beneath old family photos and my honorable discharge papers from the Navy, was a thick, folded document. A property deed, bound in a blue legal folder. It wasn't the deed to my house. It was the deed to the entire marina, including the access road, the shoreline, and the launch ramp. I didn't lease that property. I'd bought it outright 9 years ago as an investment through a small, anonymous holding company I'd set up. Dock Works LLC. A little inside joke for a retired shipwright. I walked over to my wall safe, spun the dial, and pulled the heavy steel door open. I reached in and took out a sealed folder. I sat at my desk, the folder in my hands, and I could see Miriam's smug face in my mind, watching my boat get destroyed. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I opened the folder and whispered to the empty room, "Miriam, you just demolished your future clubhouse." My lawyer, Peterson, wanted to go straight for their jugular with a lawsuit. He was talking punitive damages, depositions, injunctions. I told him to stand down. Filing a lawsuit would be playing their game, on their timeline, in their world of paperwork and legal maneuvering. They were comfortable there. I wasn't going to fight them where they were strong. I was going to pull the entire foundation out from under them. And to do that, I needed to know exactly where they stood. So I started digging. Not with a lawyer, but with a surveyor's map and the county clerk's online property database. I spent 2 full days tracing parcel lines, cross-referencing deeds, and reading through decades of zoning ordinances until my eyes burned. And just as I had always suspected, I found it. The legal boundary of the Lakeview Estates HOA ended exactly 100 feet from the high water mark of the shoreline. The docks, the launch ramp, the access road, none of it was in their designated parcel. Their claim of extended community covenants was a complete and utter fabrication. A ghost story they told to scare people into compliance. They had as much legal authority over my marina as they did over the moon. With that confirmation in hand, I went back to the docks. But this time, I wasn't a grieving boat owner. I was there as the landlord. And I was going to talk to my tenants. I started with Dale, the old fisherman. I sat with him on his boat, shared a cup of coffee from his rusty thermos, and just listened. He told me the HOA had been ticketing him for years. Fines for having crab pots stacked neatly on the dock. Fines for the color of his boat cover. Fines for a banner his granddaughter made him that said, "World's Best Grandpa." He'd paid them all, thousands of dollars over the years, because he was afraid of losing his slip, the only place he could afford to keep the boat he used to make a living. It was the same story, up and down the marina. I spoke to a young couple who got hit with a visual pollution fine because their kayak was bright yellow. I spoke to a retired Army veteran and his wife, a sweet old couple named the Clarks. The HOA had forced them to pull up their small, private floating dock, a dock that had been there for 20 years, because they had missed a single payment on a $250 annual shoreline maintenance fee they never actually owed. They hadn't just bullied me. They'd been running a systematic extortion racket for years, preying on people who didn't have the resources or the knowledge to fight back. Then I uncovered their endgame. Tucked away in the publicly available minutes of a county planning meeting from 6 months prior, I found a proposal from the Lakeview Estates HOA. It was a grand plan to acquire and redevelop the marina. They wanted to tear down the old docks and build a new private clubhouse, a spa, and a high-end restaurant exclusively for their residents. The proposal mentioned the current marina was underutilized and aesthetically blighted. My marina. My blight. It all clicked into place. They weren't just fining me over an old boat. They were trying to force me out. They wanted to devalue my property, bury me in liens and legal fees, and then swoop in and buy the land for pennies on the dollar when I couldn't afford to fight anymore. Destroying my boat wasn't just an act of petty tyranny. It was a strategic business move. That's when the last piece of the puzzle fell into my hands. My lawyer, doing some digging of his own, found an old access agreement. 15 years ago, the original developer of the HOA had signed a license with the marina's previous owner. It gave the HOA residents permission to use a small private footbridge that crossed a creek and led directly to the marina's main walkway. It was a shortcut. A convenience. And according to the terms, the license could be revoked by the marina's owner at any time, for any reason, with just 24 hours notice. I didn't file a lawsuit. I didn't send another angry letter. I simply had my lawyer draft a one-page document. A formal, legally binding revocation of the access license for the footbridge. Effective immediately. The war wasn't going to be fought in a courtroom. It was going to be fought right here, on my land. The next HOA board meeting was that Thursday. It was an open meeting, held in the community's sterile, beige clubhouse. I walked in right as Miriam was giving a self-congratulatory speech about maintaining community standards and property values. A few dozen residents were scattered in the audience, looking bored out of their minds. I walked straight to the front, past the little table with the water pitcher and plastic cups, and stood before the board. Miriam stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing with a look of pure venom. "Excuse me," she snapped, "this is a private meeting for residents only." I looked out at the sparse crowd, then back at her. "I'm not here as a resident," I said, my voice calm and steady, carrying through the quiet room. "I'm here as your neighbor. Your landlord, actually." I placed a copy of the license revocation on the table directly in front of her. "As of tomorrow morning at sunrise, your community's access to the marina footbridge is terminated. The bridge is on my property. You and your residents are no longer permitted to use it. Anyone who does will be considered trespassing, and I will prosecute." The room went silent. You could hear the low hum of the air conditioning. Miriam's face went from pale to a blotchy, furious red. She snatched the paper, her eyes scanning it frantically, looking for a loophole that wasn't there. "You can't do this," she shrieked, slamming the paper down on the table. "We have an agreement." I looked her straight in the eye. "You had an agreement with the previous owner. I am the owner now." Then I turned and looked at the audience of residents. And I don't take kindly to people who bulldoze my property and then lie to the police about it. I turned and walked toward the door. As I reached it, I heard something I hadn't expected. A quiet, tentative sound at first, then a little louder. Someone was clapping. Then another person joined in. By the time I stepped out into the cool evening air, a small but undeniable ripple of applause was echoing behind me. The board members were stunned into silence, their faces a mixture of shock and rage. The war had started, and I had just won the first battle without firing a single shot. Revoking that license was just pulling the first pin on the grenade. Now I had to make sure I was standing clear of the blast. The very next morning, my old Navy buddy, Eli Vance, rolled up to the marina in his work truck. Eli's a master mechanic who can fix anything with a roll of duct tape and a well-placed curse word. He also happens to run a small commercial security company on the side. I'd called him the night before. "Eli, I'd said, "I need a fence." He just grunted. "What kind of varmints we keeping out?" I told him. He was there by sunrise. We spent the day in the hot sun, sinking 8-foot steel posts into the ground. By late afternoon, a heavy-duty chain-link fence ran along the entire property line where the footbridge met my land. At the entrance to the bridge, Eli's crew installed a commercial-grade smart gate, the kind that requires a key card. It was tall, imposing, and looked like something you'd find at a military base. To finish it off, Eli mounted 4 high-definition, night vision security cameras on tall poles, giving us a perfect view of the gate, the bridge, and anyone who even thought about hopping the fence. As he packed up his tools, he clapped me on the shoulder. "That ought to send a message, Jack." It wasn't just a message. It was a declaration. The marina was now a fortress. While Eli was securing the physical ground, I went back to my lawyer, Peterson, not to sue, but to hire his firm's forensic accounting department. "I want you to audit them," I told him. "Go through every public record, every tax filing, every meeting minute, every budget proposal for the last 10 years. I want to know where every single penny they've collected in these bogus fines has gone." It was expensive, but it was an investment. Bullies like Miriam operate in the dark. I was about to flip on every light in the house. A week later, the first report from the accountants came back, and it was better, or worse, depending on your perspective, than I could have ever imagined. It turned out the Lakeview HOA was not just poorly managed, it was fundamentally corrupt. The audit uncovered a pattern of illegal activity that was breathtaking in its arrogance. They had filed dozens of improper property liens, often without the legally required board vote. They had been collecting tens of thousands of dollars in these made-up, visual fines and channeling the money into an unaudited slush fund that the treasurer controlled directly. None of it was in the official budget. They were operating far outside the authority granted to them in their own founding documents. They weren't a homeowners association. They were a gang. Armed with this information, I made my next move. I didn't go to the authorities yet. I went to the people. I drafted a simple, one-page letter. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Notice to the residents of Lakeview Estates." The letter was polite but direct. It explained that I was the legal owner of the marina property and that I was investigating a series of unauthorized fines issued by the HOA board. I wrote, "If you or anyone you know has been fined by the HOA for the appearance or storage of personal property such as boats, kayaks, paddleboards, or dock furniture, please contact me." I included a dedicated email address and a new burner phone number. I printed 300 copies and, instead of mailing them, I hired a local kid to deliver one to every single doorstep in the Lakeview community. It cost me $50 and a couple of pizzas. The response was a tidal wave. My new phone started ringing that same afternoon and didn't stop for 3 days. The email inbox filled up so fast I had to create folders just to keep track of it all. People sent me copies of bogus violation notices going back years. They sent me pictures of canceled checks for fines they'd paid out of fear. Some of the residents, empowered by my letter, started flooding the HOA's public email address with official requests for their own financial records. The first big crack in their dam appeared a week later. Every year, the HOA hosted a big, summer kickoff party. It was their signature event, a big affair with catered food, a live band, and fireworks over the water. It was always held on the marina's main lawn because it was the only large, flat, scenic spot they could use. An email went out to all residents from Miriam Slade. It was short and bitter. It said that due to unforeseen venue complications, the annual party was cancelled. That email was a spark in a dry forest. Suddenly, the community wasn't just grumbling, they were openly angry. They started asking questions. They knew I was the reason the party was cancelled. And they weren't mad at me. They were mad at the board who had lost them the privilege. The cancelled party was the crack in the dam, but the flood came a week later. A young, hungry reporter from the local news station got wind of the story. She called me, asking for a comment about the dispute with the Lakeview HOA. I invited her to meet me at the Marina. I didn't shout or make accusations. I just stood there on my own land, with the empty, debris-strewn slip behind me, and told her the truth, plain and simple. I showed her the photos of my wife's boat, before and after. I showed her the deed to the property. And then I laid out the damning facts from the audit, the illegal liens, the slush fund, the extortion racket. I didn't have to raise my voice. The facts were a hammer. The story ran on the 6 o'clock news that night. The quiet, simmering anger in the community erupted into a full-blown firestorm. Miriam Slade and her board panicked. They saw control slipping through their fingers, so they did what cornered bureaucrats always do: they called an emergency meeting to address the misinformation. They thought they could spin the narrative. They had no idea I was bringing receipts. The meeting was packed. News cameras were in the back. I waited for Miriam to finish her pathetic speech, then I walked to the front, connected my phone to their projector, and played Dale's video for the entire room to see. The sound of my wife's boat splintering filled the hall. The image of Miriam's smug face shouting, "Just finished the job," was 10 feet tall. There were audible gasps. While the room was still in stunned silence, my lawyer, Peterson, walked in, flanked by 2 detectives from the state attorney's office. He handed them a thick folder. It turned out the contractor who demolished my boat, facing his own liability, had confessed everything. Miriam had provided him with a forged demolition permit, complete with a fake signature and a blurry, photocopied county seal. It was no longer a civil matter. It was felony fraud. The scene that followed was better than anything Hollywood could write. Miriam and her treasurer were escorted out of the building in handcuffs, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated shock. The local news captured the whole thing. The whole rotten structure collapsed. The state audit triggered by the arrests uncovered years of fraud, forcing the HOA into receivership. By a near-unanimous vote of the homeowners, it was officially dissolved. The reign of terror was over. The legal battles ended with a settlement that covered the full value of the boat and significant punitive damages. But the money felt wrong in my pocket. So, I took the entire settlement and established the Hannah Hanley Memorial Scholarship at the local community college, a permanent fund for students going into the trade programs. It felt right, like turning splintered wood into something that could grow. I carved a new sign for the Marina myself, from the last salvageable piece of mahogany. It just says, in simple letters, Hannah's Marina. Justice isn't something you find in a law book. It's a level deck, the right to be left alone, and the peace that comes from knowing your neighbors have your back. They thought they could bulldoze a memory. But all they really did was show a whole community how to fight back.